is derived from the sun. They sort of figure in mythology. They kind of, are used to designate various kind of like natural phenomena that these guys like. And in that circumstance, you would expect these things to be renewed a lot. So I don't think that, so you might have some derivatives based on the N stem form of the sun word, and some derivatives based on the L stem or the R stem form, or whatever language we're talking about. I don't think we necessarily want to assume that there's just one option for what, what the base of the derivative might have been. It's just a constant process of renewal, and that's one interesting thing to kind of learn just from this discussion. So I think you want to be a bit more subtle about that. Chapter 2, I think, is also really nice. The excellent thing is here you have basically an emendation attached to your name, which is very exciting. There's some morphological stuff which we could talk about. I think there are basically 4 options here for these compounds. The 3 that you have here, and that's something like, anaimatos. That could be both a toe derivative, but more likely it's just an O derivative named to the oblique stem. Right? So that's the 4th option here. And I think a lot of these things in Greek are actually just that 4th option. Yeah. Chapter 3, nice etymology. I think this is good. There's some small things we'll talk about. One thing that needs, I think, some rearranging, or at least some clarity, is the sort of approach to the semantics of the root. Where did it mean grow? Where did it mean big? What's the relationship with these things? Is, to grow already the plural language? Is it development of the individual languages? You sort of just kind of skirt these issues by now it means big, now it means grow, and we need some clarity. Chapter 4. This one also I think is really good, very nice etymology. As we talked about, I especially like the discussion of the Hittite, Indo-Iranian, Latin facts. This sort of new arrangement I think also is really, really good. I don't think I really have anything else to, there's some small things we'll talk about together. This Ariteketos. I like the basic idea. I think the etymology is definitely right. And you sort of marshal all kinds of wonderful stuff. I don't exactly like what you've kind of done with it, though. This assumption that in the poetic register, the verb took on this meaning to say or to sing, and that somehow this is lost from everyday language in Greek. It survives in the poetry. I don't like that idea. I don't think that is really at all convincing. But you have the germs here for a much better approach, which is on the one hand, right, we know the verb just meant to point out or to show. We know that it had legalistic uses, right? So it meant specifically used in a ritual context where it meant to sort of indicate, some legalistic way, right? And in Indo-Iranian, interestingly enough, we also have it used for sort of the distribution of wealth, distribution of goods, of gifts, and things like that. And in fact, one of the Vedic passages where it's paired with something similar to what we have in Greek is specifically in a kind of gift exchange sort of situation. So a much more interesting claim would be that this verb was actually used in a context like that, that it had a kind of, maybe a sort of, this was a verb that you could use when you're designating or apportioning, wealth in some gift exchange context, and that's why it's actually used with these hymns, because the poet's offering a hymn, and the god is going to give in return, and it's that usage that survives. That escapes this kind of, that once kind of trivial assumption that this thing took on the verb, took on the sense to say, but then this bizarre circumstance where it's that meaning somehow disappears from Greek. And that's a much more interesting claim, which is kind of buried into it. So I think that I would sort of approach it from that perspective, where you can actually say something really, really quite interesting. And then the Latin stuff is basically either somehow to be related to that, or is just part of this trivial development from to point out, to say. Chapter 6, I'm not going to pretend that I have anything interesting to say about this one. What I really liked here was the discussion of Hachat Aspa, which really sort of makes clear, I think, what's going on with that name. And I think that with that one, you sort of provide the mythological background for how we should perhaps understand that. Presumably this is a guy whose horses are somehow identified have qualities that are associated with the horses of the Ashvins or something like that. But the morphological analysis, I think you really just do want to assume that Seichate is real, and that Haichot is really just that. I mean, and this would be whose horses, are, wet as the result of the same process that we kind of talk about with the Ashvin sort of saving Surya or Ushas or whoever. Yeah.
So not a really old T-stem nominal formation, but just the
it's
verbal
really
stem,
just like a
kind of secondarily.
Bharadvaja type formation, but derived from a Western Haichate, which is found in Vedic Seichate. I don't see why we can't take that seriously. And that just morphologically makes sense. Everything is sort of. We can talk more about that. Are we on time?
Okay.
And then part 2, the grammar of poetry, chapter 7. Here, I really like the explanation of these evitative forms. I think that's really, really nice. To explain why they're limited basically to the aorist in a nice way. I think Greg made a good point about the Herodotus stuff. Maybe these were, felt to be somehow fancy.